Imagine it's 9 to September 2020. You are a 47-year-old nurse living in Caracas, Venezuela. You work the night shift at a public children's hospital where sick kids arrive faster than supplies do. Only 3 nurses show up for a shift that should have 8 because the others have quit, taken side jobs, or left the country. Your monthly pay is between $3.50 and $4, which means your salary can vanish in a single trip to the market. Before leaving home, you wrap your dinner in paper, half an avocado, and a small corn pancake. You still go to work, because the children are waiting and because walking away from them would feel like walking away from yourself. If you have ever wondered how a country with the world's largest proven oil reserves could leave a nurse choosing between groceries and duty, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a mystery, and it is not bad luck. It is a pattern. It has happened before, in different languages, under different flags, and it almost always begins with the same comforting lie, that easy money can replace a healthy economy. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Now the turn. The hospital where you work does not simply have a funding problem. It has a currency problem, a supply problem, a trust problem. Behind all of that, a state problem. The masks run short. Water fails. Colleagues leave. Your husband used to send home small remittances from Peru, money sent from abroad, but the pandemic takes that away too. You sell soft drinks from your house to survive. And somewhere above your life, officials still talk as if this crisis arrived from nowhere, as if it blew in like a storm. But Venezuela's collapse did not arrive like lightning. It arrived like termites in the floorboards, quiet at first, easy to excuse, hidden by the shine of oil money and the language of justice and sovereignty. By the time the floor gave way, millions were already standing on it. That is what this story is about. Not just how Venezuela fell, but why so many people ignored warning signs that were visible years before the worst headlines. We are going to look at Venezuela, then at Argentina in 2001, Zimbabwe in 2008, and the bank panics of Greece, Cyprus, and Lebanon. Different places, different decades, same old human habit. When money is flowing, when leaders are popular, when the state can still pay the bills for one more month, people convince themselves that the crack in the wall is only paint. History shows something harsher. Collapse is rarely a surprise. It is usually a long argument between reality and denial. Reality always wins. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. A national collapse usually does not begin with one dramatic mistake. It begins when a country starts treating temporary income like permanent wealth. Think of a family that wins one huge bonus, tears down the walls of the house, fires the plumber, stops saving, borrows more money. Then they act shocked when the roof leaks 2 years later. That is the basic mechanism. In Venezuela's case, oil was the bonus. For decades, oil brought in foreign currency, money from abroad that paid for imports, public jobs, subsidies, and political peace. Oil was not just an industry. It was the master pipe feeding the whole building. When prices were high, the state looked strong. When prices fell, the weakness underneath was exposed. But oil alone did not destroy Venezuela. Mismanagement did. Price controls told producers what they could charge, even when those prices no longer covered costs. Exchange controls told people what foreign currency was worth, even when the official number had become fantasy. Expropriations, which means the state taking over private businesses, scared away investment and broke supply chains. Then came the fatal move. Instead of cutting the deficit, the gap between what the government spent and what it actually had, the state turned to the central bank. It printed money. Printing money can feel painless at first. That is the trap. It is like adding seawater to soup. The pot looks fuller. For a moment, it even seems to solve the problem. But the more you add, the less anyone can swallow it. Prices rise. Savings rot. Imports dry up. Stores empty. People run because the currency itself is melting in their hands. Once you understand that mechanism, Venezuela stops looking like an exception. It starts looking like a case study. This brings us directly to the first part of the story. Venezuela was not supposed to become a warning. For much of the 20th century, it was one of Latin America's richer countries, an oil state with a strong currency and a sense of future. That memory mattered, because it made later decay harder to see. People compare today's trouble not to some perfect standard, but to yesterday's pride. When Hugo Chavez took office in 1999, oil production was around 3 million barrels per day. Oil already made up more than 90% of Venezuela's exports, which meant the country was leaning on one leg. Still, high oil prices in the 2000s made that stance look stable. Chavez used the boom to fund social programs. These programs did produce real gains for a time. Poverty fell, the state spent freely, and supporters saw justice, critics saw danger. Both were looking at the same river from different banks. The trouble was not social spending by itself. The trouble was building it on oil income that could swing wildly, while weakening the institutions that might force restraint. Chavez fired thousands of experienced PDVSA workers after the 2002 to 2003 oil strike. He tightened state control. He nationalized hundreds of businesses. He used price controls and exchange controls to force the economy to obey political commands. In the short term, these moves projected strength. In the long term, they hollowed out the machinery that kept the country producing. This is the part many outsiders missed. They saw oil revenue and assumed capacity, but a country can look rich while eating its seed corn. Venezuela was not repairing the engine. It was painting the hood. Brookings later noted that by 2018, oil production had fallen significantly. Production dropped from roughly 3 million barrels per day in 1999 to about 1.25 million. Imports were slashed. The private sector had been strangled by regulations and seizures. The economy had already fallen by almost 50% since 2013. Then oil prices crashed in 2014. Suddenly the master pipe narrowed. A healthier economy might have bent and survived. Venezuela could not, because its other supports had already been cut away. Maduro inherited not a fortress, but a stage set. From the front, it still looked solid. Behind it, there was air. So the government did what weak states often do. It doubled down on illusion. The fiscal deficit widened. Money creation accelerated. Currency reforms came and went. In August 2018, Maduro cut 5 zeros off the Bolivar and raised the minimum wage 30-fold. It looked dramatic, but it was theater against arithmetic. Reuters reported that prices were rising 4% per day that September. This was on the way to an IMF estimate of 1,970,000% inflation in 2018 and 10 million percent in 2019. Hyperinflation, which means prices rising so fast that money loses value faster than you can spend it, had arrived. And what did ordinary people experience? Not charts, not theories. They experienced the disappearance of ordinary life. Nurses earning $4 a month, teachers leaving classrooms to sell $1 lunches, pensioners protesting because work bought medicine for a few days, families skipping meat, then skipping meals. By 2023, one estimate said living standards had fallen 74% from 2013. Since 2014, roughly a quarter of Venezuela's population had left the country. This was a massive peacetime economic collapse. It happened under a government that kept insisting the system was under attack, not under failure. Here's something I want you to think about. At what point does a promise stop being money? Is it when your savings buy less each week, when the exchange rate shifts, or only when the ATM goes dark? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because the next part of this story is something most people never hear. The second part of the story is that Venezuela was not even unique in the way denial worked. Look at Argentina in 2001. Different ideology, different export mix, different history, but the same deep temptation. Use a policy that works, then pretend it lasts forever. In the 1990s, Argentina pegged its peso to the US dollar. A peg means fixing your currency to another at a set rate. At first, it felt like salvation. Inflation fell. Investors returned. The country was praised as a reform success, but a fixed exchange rate is like wearing a borrowed suit. It looks sharp until your body changes. Argentina's economy slowed. Foreign capital fled after crises in East Asia and Russia. The government, unable to print freely, borrowed instead. Debt piled up. Unemployment went above 20% in 2001. The same policy that had once looked like discipline became a trap. To preserve the appearance of stability, the government kept defending an arrangement that no longer matched reality. People sensed it before officials admitted it. Depositors rushed to withdraw cash. The state answered with the Corralito in late 2001. This freeze trapped about $40 billion in bank deposits and capped cash withdrawals. Imagine being middle class in Buenos Aires then. Not rich, not poor, just careful. You paid taxes, saved in the bank, maybe hoped to send your child to university. Then one weekend the fence goes up around your own money. Reuters later described riots and vandalized ATMs. Millions of middle-class Argentines fell into poverty. The economy would shrink by about a fifth. Then came a massive default. Argentina defaulted on more than $100 billion of debt. And what matters here is the sequence of events. First comes the useful policy, then the pride attached to it, then the refusal to admit that conditions have changed, then the pressure on banks, then the controls. The collapse is like ice thinning underfoot. It feels gradual until the end. Most people do not fall because the lake changes in 1 second. They fall because each step was only a little worse. Argentina's leaders were trapped by promises they did not know how to unwind without pain, so they delayed. Delay is one of history's favorite weapons. It lets officials protect their image today by increasing the cost tomorrow. Venezuela followed a related path. Its leaders also mistook a temporary arrangement for a permanent reality. Now here's where it gets interesting. Argentina shows false prices, but Zimbabwe shows destroying the meaning of money altogether. In the 2000s, Zimbabwe faced falling output, political turmoil, international isolation, and deep fiscal strain. The state printed more. This was monetary panic in slow motion. By 2008, the numbers had become surreal, with inflation peaking at 500 billion%. Trust in the Zimbabwe dollar vanished. At that scale, the exact number almost stops mattering. The currency turned into ash. Ordinary life in a hyperinflation becomes a race. You get paid and you spend immediately because waiting is punished. Shops stop posting stable prices. Wages lag behind. Fuel disappears. Bread becomes a moving target. Basics soar in price. Savings built over decades were erased. The elderly discovered that obedience is not protection when the unit of account collapses. The IMF compared Venezuela's hyperinflation to Germany in 1923 and Zimbabwe in the late 2000s. The warning was right there. Zimbabwe showed the sequence: shrinking production, deficits, money creation, loss of confidence, and flight from the currency. Hyperinflation begins when people stop believing that the printing will stop. Trust is the bridge that cracks and breaks. In both Zimbabwe and Venezuela, people learn to read reality through tiny daily signals long before the final screaming crash. The shopkeeper who refuses local currency, or the bus driver who changes fares. These are the economy speaking in low voices. Breakdown rarely gives you one official moment. It works more like a staircase sinking into fog where you smooth the danger. Venezuela also benefited from a kind of moral confusion. Early gains in poverty reduction made criticism feel like an attack on the poor. See 2026, Script Scene Splitter AI GitHub. That made honest diagnosis harder. A policy can begin by helping people and still fail if it destroys the machine that funds it. If a town uses money from a temporary gold strike to build schools, that is sensible. If it also smashes its farms, scares away builders, and prints paper when the gold runs out, the good intention does not rescue the bad arithmetic. Then came sanctions, which clearly worsened an already collapsing system, especially after 2017 and 2019. But here again, denial found a convenient shield. Once sanctions entered the story, they gave supporters of the regime a way to explain everything as foreign aggression, even though much of the structural damage had been done years earlier through price controls, exchange controls, purges, and monetary abuse. History often gives failing systems one last gift: an external villain to hide behind. That is why predictability matters. Predictability does not mean simplicity. It means the mechanism was visible long before the final headlines. The country was spending as if oil would never fall, governing as if expertise were optional, and printing as if confidence were infinite. Those are not random errors. They are flares in the dark. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. If you are still here, you're not most people. Hit subscribe, because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. Now look at all three together: Venezuela, Argentina, Zimbabwe. The same mechanism, different countries, different decades, same result. In each case, the visible crisis came late, the invisible crisis came first. First, leaders built dependence on something fragile. In Venezuela, it was oil revenue and state control. In Argentina, it was the peg and foreign borrowing. In Zimbabwe, it was the belief that the state could finance itself by force of decree. Second, warning systems were weakened. Skilled staff were purged. Independent institutions bent, bad data hidden, critics dismissed. Third, the public was given a story that made delay sound noble: sovereignty, stability, social justice, national dignity. Some of those goals were real. That is why the danger was easy to miss. A bad policy wrapped in a good moral language is like rust-painted gold. Then came the final stage. Reality demanded adjustment. The government refused or postponed it. So the adjustment happened anyway, but violently, not as an orderly reform. As a currency collapse, a bank freeze, a default, an exodus, or all four. This is why Venezuela's collapse was predictable. Not because every number was obvious on one exact day, but because the structure was wrong. When more than 90% of exports come from one commodity, when the private sector is being squeezed, when the central bank is no longer independent, when price controls create shortages, when the official exchange rate no longer matches lived reality, the country is not walking towards stability. It is stacking chairs on a rotten floor. So why did everyone ignore it? Because booms are blinding. Oil money is one reason. It can make almost any government look competent for a while. Ideology is another. Supporters see criticism as sabotage. Opponents assume the system will fail faster than it does and lose credibility when it lingers on. Foreign lenders and trading partners often prefer one more profitable year to one honest diagnosis. And ordinary people, understandably, want normal life to continue. Denial is not always stupidity. Sometimes it is exhausted hope. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. History does not tell us that every struggling country becomes Venezuela. It tells us something narrower and more useful. When a state lives off one narrow source of income, suppresses price signals, punishes production, and then finances denial with money creation or trapped savings, the same family of outcomes keeps appearing. This leads to the fourth part of the story, the part measured not in GDP, but in human damage. Who gets hurt first when a system breaks? Usually not the people with lawyers, offshore accounts, political friends, or salaries tied to hard currency. The first people hit are those standing in the open. Look at Greece in June 2015. Banks closed. Cash withdrawals were limited to 60 euros per day. For tourists, this was an inconvenience. For many locals, it was terror with paperwork. Reuters described queues at petrol stations, people stocking up on essentials, and anxious searches for ATMs that still had cash. If you owned assets abroad, you had options. If your life ran through a domestic bank account and a domestic paycheck, your world suddenly shrank. Look at Cyprus in 2013. Depositors with more than 100,000 euros at Bank of Cyprus took a 47.5% haircut, meaning nearly half of those funds were converted into bank equity to recapitalize the lender. Some people heard that and thought it only affects the wealthy. History is less neat than that. Small firms often keep payroll funds in the bank. Family businesses save working capital there. The line between a rich depositor and a business owner trying to survive is not always sharp. A banking crisis is a flood. It does not ask whether the money in the house belonged to luxury or necessity. Then look at Lebanon after 2019. The World Bank called it a deliberate depression. Real GDP was projected to fall 6.7% in 2019 and 19.2% in 2020. Poverty was expected to engulf more than half the population. The burden fell heavily on smaller depositors, workers paid in Lebanese lira, and smaller businesses. That sentence should stop you cold. Smaller depositors. In other words, people who did what they were told. They trusted banks, they worked for wages, they stayed inside the formal system, and the formal system became the trap. This is the cruelest part of collapse. It punishes virtues that were safe in normal times. Patience, loyalty, saving, specialization. The teacher who spent 19 years in a classroom, the pensioner who contributed for 35 years to Social Security, the nurse who kept showing up to night shifts. In a breakdown, these people are like houses built on the low ground. They're not morally worse than the mansions on the hill. They're simply where the water reaches first. Who walks away better? Usually the people with hard currency income, mobile skills, foreign passports, export businesses, or assets that cannot be printed away. In Venezuela, after controls loosened in 2019, some private workers, partly paid in dollars, regained a little breathing room while state workers fell further behind. The same country, the same city. Two different monetary realities. One man buys groceries, another sells candy in the subway to buy medicine. Make this concrete. In 2022, Reuters spoke with Sayer Chacon, a 43-year-old nurse in San Cristobal, earning about 250 bolivars a month, around $55 at the time. She said she did not earn enough to change the oil in her car. Ramona Franco said her teacher's salary was not enough for cheese. Alice Moreno, a 67-year-old pensioner, said he once felt middle class and now asked for alms to survive. That is what collapse does. It does not simply lower living standards. It rewrites identity. And when identity is rewritten, politics changes too. Skilled workers leave. Families split across borders. Hospitals lose staff. Schools lose teachers. Small businesses stop planning beyond a week or a month. The whole society starts living like a man carrying water in his hands. Economic collapse is never only about money. It is about time. It steals the future first. That split matters because it shows that collapse is never shared equally. It is often presented as a national tragedy, and it is. But inside that tragedy, there is sorting. The system becomes a sieve. Those with portable value slip through. Those tied to the local currency, the local bank, or the local payroll get caught in the mesh. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. So what did the survivors do differently? Not the lucky few in headlines. The ordinary people who made it through shared three characteristics. First, they noticed early when official numbers stopped matching daily life. They did not wait for a press conference to tell them what empty shelves already said. They trusted the street before the slogan. That is not cynicism. It is pattern recognition. When the map and the road disagree long enough, wise travelers stop blaming the road. Second, they reduced single-point dependence. This means one job, one bank, one currency, one state payment, one story about the future. Survival often meant having backup lines, a cousin abroad sending remittances, skills that could travel, inventory instead of cash. Third, they move faster than pride. Pride tells people, I'm not the kind of person who needs a second passport or a plan B. History is full of people who drowned defending an identity. The ones who adapted were willing to look foolish early. Collapses often do not end because leaders become wise. They end when reality forces a harder anchor onto the system. In Venezuela, inflation fell after the government tolerated dollar transactions. This matters because survivors respond to practical necessity over official fantasy. The street market understands this before the ministry. A collapsing system is like a burning staircase. The first advantage is believing the smoke.